he had manipulated her to be in the position where she was, essentially vulnerable to him. He knew each step to take to manipulate her. And what shocked me about that one was how hard it was to get some investigators to put themselves in her position about what it would have been like to be in that room, to imagine what would happen if she told her story.
Patrick Tidmarsh is a leading criminologist with 30 years of experience specialising mainly in sexual crimes. He joins me today. Patrick, tell me a little bit about how you got into this area of criminology.
It was all a bit of an accident, really. I was working in prisons back in the UK, and we were doing therapeutic work with violent men and with sex offenders. And we used to do a residency at a clinic working just with child molesters. And I became, I think, fascinated by the work there, but also, you got to think this was quite a long time ago now, back in the late 80s, early 90s. We were really just beginning to understand what was happening. And they were all there for molesting children. And I was blown away by what they were saying and how little we were doing about it back then. So they offered me a job, and I went there immediately. And then when I came across to Australia, we were just really then back in the early 90s, 92, 93, beginning to work with offenders here, both adults in prisons and in the community. And we started to work with young people who were offending as well. And the more I do this, the more compelling it is that all of us who are working in this field keep going, because there's so much more to do. And as I then moved into policing, you could see how much policing needed to change and the courts need to change in order to understand sex offending and essentially to listen to victims better and to provide a better system, a better process of justice for victims.
It sounds like it's an incredibly complex type of crime. What are the different types of reasons that people become sex offenders or are born sexual offenders? Like what are the motivations behind the crime?
Let's get this out of the way. 95% of offenders are men and young men. And the vast majority, 80% plus of victims, survivors are women and girls. So I'm going to talk about men or he for offender and she for victim survivor, just because that's the shorthand. So he will see the world in a particular way. One, they find the adult world a difficult place to navigate. So love, friendship, connection, intimacy, all those things they find extremely difficult. The second is they tend to blame anything but themselves for what they do. It's called uncontrollability in things. So it wasn't me, I was drinking alcohol, I was using pornography, or whatever it was. The third is they have a sense of entitlement. And I think we've all learned a lot about entitlement in the last few years. So they feel they should be able to do whatever they want to do to make themselves feel better. The fourth, and starting with child molesters, the fourth was that they can perceive children to be sexual objects. And I think we could also debate how clear we are as a community about objectifying children in that way. But for now, let's just say it's a particular problem with offenders. And the last one is they're particularly good at minimizing the nature of the damage that they do.
So do you have perhaps one or two cases, obviously without identifying anyone, that you can think of from your career, cases or investigations that you could pull out as something that has really sat with you for a long time or changed the way, perhaps they were a pivotal moment in your career that really changed the way you thought about things or perhaps were quite emotionally, touched you in some way?
So there are two stories that stand out, both of which I've written about. But the first one was more or less the first man I worked with in treatment in the child molester program. And he told me about the abuse of his daughter. And he started with a lot of distorted thinking and justifications and minimizing, but eventually worked. He began by saying he thought it was a consensual relationship that she wanted as much as him. And then over the course of the treatment, we sort of worked it back to when she was 3 or 4, the way he manipulated her, how he moved from one level of abuse and to another to make it more, to get to where he wanted to go effectively. And he took 7 or 8 years to do that. He knew each step to take to manipulate her. And the really shocking thing that happened. He pleaded guilty in court, but at the trial, even though he pleaded guilty, the judge, this is way back in the late 80s, the judge admonished his daughter for having participated in the sexual relationship with him.
Wow.
I know. And you might think, well, that would never happen today, but I can still hear it being said in a court because, what's happening in trials, they're not that different from the way they were back then. I mean, the rules are better, but it can be quite rough. So I was shocked by what he told me. And part of my job is as a drama therapist and sort of getting them to work through and act out what they did. And I would do an exercise with them where I would get them to show the grooming that they did and act it out and use other members of the group to act out other characters. And I remember the first time that he did it and he acted it out, he got to the end and part of the exercise was to say along the way, well, this is what I'm thinking now and this is why I do this. And he kind of worked at it so hard. I don't think he thought about what he was, the story that he was telling. So at the end of it, when he realized all the different manipulations he'd put in place over all that time, he just sat down and he said, she didn't have any choice at all, did she? And he was completely shocked at what he had just said out loud. And it was a good moment in therapy, but more importantly, it kind of cemented for me how much we still put pressure on victims. We still hold them accountable when it's him that's doing it. It's him that's manipulating it. So that was the first one that really blew my mind. And I still train to that story every course I do with whomever, because it's so important. And the second one was almost the first case I helped investigators with when I came across the Vic Poll. And it was a woman who reported that she'd gone for a massage. And during the course of the massage, she had been digitally raped. And that at the end of the massage, he had said to her, how was that? And she'd said, fine, thanks, and paid and left without saying anything. And waited 2 weeks before she reported and couldn't believe that she'd waited 2 weeks and couldn't believe that she'd said thank you and all of that. And then as we worked on the case, we worked back to this guy's method, and I won't go through it in detail because it's deeply unpleasant, but essentially he had manipulated her over the first 30 minutes of the time they had spent. They didn't know each other, they'd never had a massage there before, to be in the position where she was, essentially vulnerable to him and unable to decide what the consequences would be of confronting him about what he was doing in the lead up to that. And then felt that the safest way to get out of there was to pay, say thank you, just leave. And then at the end of it, so shocked, her sister says, go to the police. And she said, well, I don't know how they're ever going to believe this. I'll just try and get over it. And so within 2 weeks, she can't sleep, she can't eat. And eventually she loved her job. And eventually after 2 weeks, she was in the car park and couldn't go into work because she was sobbing. She said, I'm going to the police, and did. And what shocked me about that one was how hard it was to get some investigators to put themselves in her position about what it would have been like to be in that room, to be on that table, to get out of that space, to imagine what would happen if she told her story. And again, I think it tells us how far we have to go, how many myths and misconceptions are still out there that we have to deal with. So those are probably the two that I talk about and think about most often.
Patrick Tidmarsh's new book, The Whole Story, Investigating Sexual Crime, Truth, Lies and the Path to Justice, is available now.